So, for recording purposes, welcome again, everyone, to our workshop today. We're very glad you're all here, and we really hope you're going to find our session useful. Because we only have an hour and a half, we try to include as much content in terms of theoretical, but also practical elements that we want to consider. But we signpost to a lot of additional resources, and all the slides will be made available shortly after the event on the event's webpage. The format of the workshop consists of a presentation with an overview of anonymization techniques, practical examples, some key considerations, and also a lot of signposting to tools. Again, everything will be made available onto the event's webpage. Now, to make sure that it's not just talking, we are including some Mentimeter exercises. They're meant to reinforce the concepts in real time because we are introducing quite a lot of concepts during this session. And we've also created a Padlet for you, so you might be used with the Q&A within Zoom directly. We moved on from that because we realized with this workshop some of the questions, and I would say probably around half of them, they actually have follow-up questions and so on. And they can be very complex questions as well. So we're using this Padlet, and the link is available in the chat, for you to ask questions about anonymization, concepts that you did not quite understand, any additional resources that you might need. Please feel free to put all of that in the Padlet. We do keep it open for 48 hours, so it's going to be open tomorrow as well. We know when it comes to training events, sometimes questions, and not only training events, sometimes even meetings, questions can come up a bit later on, so you can add your questions tomorrow as well. And next week, when we're back at work, we will review all the questions, put in all the answers, and actually make that question and answer Word document available on the events page so that you can follow up on all the different questions. The Menti is used for the questions we have for you, so try not to put the answers to the Menti on the Padlet. If it happens, it happens. That's perfectly fine. But of course, any questions, anything that's unclear, please drop us a line in the chat. So to begin with, a little bit of an icebreaker, what are the first words that come to mind when you're thinking about anonymization? The link for the Menti is directly in the chat, so you can use directly the Menti link from the chat. If you prefer to answer from your phone, you can just open your camera application and scan the QR code. That might be easier if you have a mobile phone at hand. We are getting answers. Menti is working. You never know with these tools. It's like, oh, it is not working. It is working. Privacy, ethics, personal data, protection and privacy, we can see are the highest ones. Curious, are we getting an animal? Are we getting maybe a fruit? Sometimes it happens. Have seen chameleon a lot of the times when it comes to anonymization, confidentiality, safety of participants. It's exactly that, because as researchers, we need to care for our participants. It's the do no harm, right? So we use anonymization techniques to be able to share the data, but protecting our participants. So it's a key consideration. GDPR, yes, data protection, UK GDPR, Data Protection Act. Utility, fantastic, because when it comes to anonymization, it's not only treating the data to protect participants, but it's keeping the utility in that data. And that's why we're going to see, we talk about a three-prong strategy that we advise at UK Data Service to be used. That's amazing. Fantastic answers. Traceability, pseudonyms, all of those. Unguaranteeable, very good. And we're going to see that there are limitations, but again, there are solutions that we can put in place to ensure that our, as we like to call it, and luckily in the UK we have a lot of legislation and a lot of bodies, for example, the Information Commission's Office, that provide a lot of guidance around anonymization and how can we ensure anonymization is effective. Now, trying to get to know you a little bit, what is the most sensitive type of data you work with? It's the same Menti code, the same Menti link. You can scan the QR code if you've closed it. Just curious, what type of data that you think is really sensitive you usually work with? There are no wrong answers. Benefits data, longitudinal data. Yes, of course, with longitudinal data, there's that additional disclosure risk because you have the multiple waves. Names, photos, health data, mobility data, EEG and behavior data, health data, sexuality, a lot of the special category under UK GDPR are coming up, and we're discussing about that in a little bit. That's fantastic. Oh, someone just said special category. As I was just saying, that's amazing. Names are coming up there a lot, and of course, as researchers, we do collect a lot of personal information and a lot of sensitive information as well that is coming up. We have to. Of course, there's always the consideration of, do I need to gather that personal data? And that's part of legislation. But legislation is not here to put us off or to make research harder, by no means. Legislation is here to protect us and to protect the participants as well. And that's why it's fantastic that we have ways around making sure data is effectively anonymized. I'll close the QR code because when it comes to this one, we have a little scale here. How confident are you in your understanding of anonymization? We don't know where the answers are coming from, so please be as truthful as possible. Sometimes we can see the scale going up a little bit the other way after the session because there are some concepts that maybe you didn't think about while you were anonymizing your data. But that's fantastic. We have a lot of people in the room that are moderately confident as well, slightly confident. That's amazing. A mix of experiences. And again, while the session is introductory, we have so many different signposting to tools. So we're going to be talking a little bit about semi-automated tool for anonymization as well. We hope those of you that are confident or very confident in anonymization still find those tools very relevant and very useful. So when it comes to today's agenda, I did mention we have quite a packed agenda considering the topic. We're first talking about anonymization in the data context because we can't talk about anonymization without thinking of what data are we working with and what other data is out there. We are introducing our three-pronged approach for data sharing, especially when it comes to the social sciences. However, this can be used in other domains as well. What is the applicable legislation and what are some considerations when it comes to this legislation? Again, here we're talking about the law. We need to respect the law. But it also brings in the question of ethics as well. So as researchers, it's not only just about doing right by law, it's doing right by participants, doing what's morally and ethically correct. What are some types of identifiers and what is this effective anonymization that I keep going on about? What are some practical anonymization steps? So we devised this very short plan, how to do anonymization. And then we talk a little bit about anonymization techniques for numerical data, followed by anonymization techniques for qualitative data. The previous apply both for quant and qual. When it comes to identifiers, it doesn't matter if you're working with qualitative data, say for example transcripts, or you're working with surveys. Names are going to be names, addresses are going to be addresses, and so on. Then we have a little bit about anonymization and AI considerations. This is very much focused on what we need to consider if we're using AI to anonymize data, but also a little bit about how about AI being able to reverse anonymization, because there are some concerns around that. And of course, AI is everywhere nowadays, and a lot of people are using it. And as I said, at the very end, we just have a Q&A session. We'll try to keep it around 15 minutes. It depends on how long it takes for the content to be delivered. We have a lot of content, but not to worry. Any questions, please do put them on the Padlet because we'll come back to them next week. And again, questions tomorrow that you have as well, please put them onto the Padlet, and we'll make that document available for you on the webpage of the event. So data anonymization and key considerations. Anonymization is a valuable tool that allows data to be shared, we all know that, while protecting research participants. Now, every data source and every data context is very different. And this is the difficulty when someone comes and says, how should I anonymize this data? And we have a very brief description of the data. It's very hard to realize how is the best way to anonymize it. Because what are the types of identifiers in that data? Do we have direct identifiers? Do we have a lot of of indirect identifiers. Most of the times it's the indirect identifiers. The direct identifiers are removed. What is the type of data? Are we talking about survey data? Are we talking about audio visual data, transcript data? All of them have different considerations and different ways of dealing with anonymizations. What are the ethical considerations? Do your research participants know that the data is going to be shared, how the data is going to be shared? When informed consent is not possible, again, informed consent should be always considered, but there are situations when it is not possible. What are the safeguards that you are putting in place? Has this been approved by an ethics board, etc., etc.? What are the confidentiality concerns when it comes to the data, the risk to the participants, and have participants been informed about their withdrawal rights as well? And what are the data sharing strategies? This is why we focus on that three-prong approach, because it's not only about the data itself and the anonymization. I'm changing this, I am removing that. No, it's about who's accessing the data, how are they accessing the data, are there any terms and conditions when it comes to that data and how they're going to use it for their project, what is going to happen at the end of the project, and so on. And we're going to give the example, of course, from UK Data Service when it comes to the access control, but responsible repositories, all of them will have a framework to deal with different data sharing strategies as needed. So the elusive three-prong approach to data sharing: consent, anonymization, and access. We're informing our participants of how are we going to share the data, what are the benefits of this data sharing. And again, when it comes to benefits, it's not only for us as researchers, my catalog record is referable, or even my paper is reproducible, or not even just for the funders in terms of, oh, they've asked me to do this so I can show I'm transparent, I'm reproducible, and so on. It's actually for the public because it encourages even more research, and we see that on a daily basis at UK Data Service, where data that was originally collected with a clear focus on this is the type of research that we want to do, these are our research questions, is then used to influence policy in related areas, but different areas, and also for the participants themselves. So especially when it comes to vulnerable populations or hard to reach population, is so important for, rather than going through the same process over and over again with the same people, to actually be able to make that data available for others to use. When it comes to anonymization, treating the data and reducing that risk of re-identification, so people are no longer recognizable in the data, but thinking about the data utility. And again, this is something that can easily be done where we talk about over-anonymization and so much information is taken out. More common for qualitative, especially transcript data, rather than quantitative data, but it can happen when almost everything that's needed from a secondary research perspective, from a reproducibility perspective as well, is just completely removed. So this is why Maureen is going to talk to you about some of the different techniques that can be used. So rather than fully removing, say, for example, the age, oh, should we consider this and should we consider that? So we'll see that in just a little bit. And finally, access. As I said, who is going to access the data? How are they going to access the data? For how long are they going to access the data? Are you going to have user agreements in place? So again, terms and conditions. And to bear in mind, I like to say this because I would say in the last 3-4 years, there's a lot of panic when researchers hear about open access, because yes, there is an open access agenda. We want to make our data openly available. Openly available doesn't necessarily mean an open access license, such as Creative Commons, or for government departments, open government license, and so on. No, it's making the data as widely available as possible. And yes, sometimes that means that we're going to have user agreements in place. Or when we talk about really sensitive data, potentially personal data, not directly identifiable, but where, say, for example, a lot of information is still retained in that data, is still considered personal data, we can leverage legislation. And again, In the UK, for example, we have the Digital Economy Act that is helping the different government departments and public bodies to share personal data, the identify data, and we can use things like the 5 Saves framework, which ensures that researchers are actually accredited. You end up approving the access for that use. They need to demonstrate public good. Why are they using that data for? And also the outputs are actually being checked. There are some efforts being done when it comes to the 5 Saves framework for qualitative data as well. Currently, that's applicable for quantitative data because of the safe output component, which is manageable when it comes to quant data, far more manageable, and a bit more difficult when it comes to qualitative data. But there are efforts out there looking at improving the framework to be applicable for qualitative data as well. Now, employing these three separate steps is actually enabling most data to be shared. This is why we have so much data being shared in the UK. Again, in the UK, we are very lucky, considering the legislation and the fantastic researchers that are really, really keen to share that data and improve policy and improve other research. Now, when it comes to data protection consideration, I've mentioned in the past, I'm a key fan of the Information Commissioner's Office. They actually have a webinar on anonymization just today from 3 to 4 as well. I'm unsure whether you can still register for it now. I'll just put the link in the chat for everyone. You can have a look. They will make everything available as well. So in case you can't make it, it's 3 to 4. For probably a couple of years, ICO have been making available draft anonymization guidance. They have finally published the final anonymization guidance just in April, so just last month. And they're fantastic because, again, they're introducing this concept of how do we effectively anonymize data. And of course, they're very knowledgeable when it comes to UK GDPR and the Data Protection Act, which are the data protection legislation when it comes to the UK context. So what is this personal data? Well, under UK GDPR and the DPA is information that relates to an identified or identifiable natural person, be it directly or indirectly. This is where a lot of panic came in when GDPR came into force before UK GDPR, taking into account other information derived from published sources. And we're going back again. Think about the three-prong approach. This is why we're not talking about just the anonymization. We're talking about the consent and access as well. We've seen in the Menti, a lot of you are working with special category data. Special category data is more sensitive personal data, and they require additional attention and protection due to the sensitivity because far more harm can come when this data is, for example, released to malicious individuals. So we might have data revealing racial or ethnic origin, political opinions, religious or philosophical beliefs, trade union membership, genetic data, biometric data that uniquely identifies a natural person, data concerning health. We've seen a couple of people working with health data, and a person's sex life or sexual orientation. So there are additional consideration and additional safeguards that we must put in place when we work with this data as well, but also when we're anonymizing and wanting to share that data for future research. Now, at the UK Data Service, we also want to introduce the concept of personal information because this gives a little bit of more background when it comes to our access framework. So we have personal data that's all around a natural person, so a human. I just sounded like an alien there, a human. Personal information is actually defined by Statistics and Registration Services Act from 2007, and it's information that relates to or identifies an individual, including a body corporate. So here we're talking about organizations as well. So take personal data, add organizations on top of that. That is personal information. We're actually including organizations in there as well. Now, from a consent and participant communication perspective, and we do have events that focus very much on this, and we have the link to all of our events. We have our colleague Hina, who's fantastic, and she can always be contacted as well if you have questions around, oh, how am I using the consent? Should I add anything else in it, and so on. what I really like to make the difference is this consent from a legal view and consent from an ethical point of view. Because consent can be used as a legal basis for processing personal data. Yes, that's very valid. However, the most common basis for research conducted with personal data in the UK for public bodies and authorities is public trust. So those working government organizations, universities, you will most likely be using public trust. If unsure, always check with your organization. Your organization will nevertheless have some information about the the legal basis that they're using for processing personal information within research, and potentially they can provide you with some wording that you can use in your participant communication as well. There's also legitimate interest, and that's usually used for all non-public bodies, so charities, commercial companies. Again, consent can still be used and that's valid, but we usually use the public task or legitimate interest to process personal data, and anonymization is also a processing a processing process. Informed consent from an ethical perspective must always be considered no matter what legal basis for processing data you are actually using. So say, for example, I'm using public task. I work in a university. I work for Essex University. I'm going to be using public task when I do my research. However, as an ethical researcher, I should always consider, can I actually inform my participants about how the data is going to be used, how the data is going to be shared, and so on. Again, there are situations where that's not possible, but those should be reduced to a very, very minimum. Whenever possible, informed consent should be used. Now, at UK Data Service, we use this three-tier access and licensing options for data because data exists on a spectrum. It's not black and white. It's not personal and anonymized. It's a spectrum. So we have open data, which is suitable for data that are not classified either as personal data or personal information. This is why I introduced the personal information context. When there is no residual risk of disclosure, there is no negligible risk of actually identifying someone, or where consent to share personal data as collected is in place. It is rare, but for example, when you're collecting, it's usually with transcript data, so qual data, and it's usually with elites or public figures. They do like to be acknowledged, so they might give you actually consent to share the personal data as collected for future reuse. There might be situations around video and audio data as well, when that data can be shared as collected because participants were okay with that. Now, most of the collections that we make available in our catalog, we have over 9,900 now, and around 83%, I think, are actually safeguarded data. In safeguarded data, they're data that are treated. So again, we don't just share, we've collected the data and we share it as is. No, we're still treating that data, and we're going to see different techniques that can be used for that. But we're also adding terms and conditions of use that are very specific and actually respect the legislation and also the ethical components when it comes to research. This is effectively anonymized data. And again, we are so lucky to have the ICO providing such amazing guidance and understanding that data exists in this fantastic spectrum rather than the black and white that sometimes can be seen when it comes to data. Finally, we do have the controlled access level, and this is suitable for data classified either as personal data or personal information, but also data that are particularly sensitive, either commercially or otherwise. And as briefly mentioned before, the 5-Safe framework is used to provide access to this data, meaning that researchers need to be accredited, they have to have their project approved, they can only work in a secure environment, they can't just take that data in and out, and even their outputs are being checked for secondary disclosure. Now, types of identifiers. Direct identifiers, it's in the name, anything that directly identifies data subjects, and indirect identifiers, information that in combination may uniquely identify data subjects. Bearing in mind that it can potentially be linked to other sources of data. Now, I've talked a lot. So it's time for another Menti. please give us some examples of direct identifiers that you've worked with, some direct identifiers that you've heard of, some direct identifiers that really scare you. How do we actually treat them? It's the same Menti link, but you can again scan the QR code on the page. Sometimes it makes it easier. Um, if the phone is behaving, of course, sometimes the phone decides not to scan the QR code. Name. Yes, that's fantastic. Email. Full name. IDs, yes, depending on the type of ID. Fantastic. Address. Face. Social security number. Username. With a username, there are some considerations there because a username could potentially be an anonymized username. So could that be an indirect identifier? Um, We are getting some indirect identifiers in here as well. For example, age. I just gave you the answer for the next one. That is not a problem. Things they have written. So when we think about direct identifiers, is what directly identifies a person. Name is the big one. That's fantastic. Address. They're uniquely linked to a person, potentially a couple of people, because at an address you will have multiple people living. ID, again, depending on the ID, it could be, for example, the ID of a car that's uniquely linked to a person and so on. Now, let's see indirect identifiers, as we had a couple in the previous one. There's so many indirect identifiers. Zip code, so postcode, partial postcode, yeah. Hometown, position at job, age, yes. It's fantastic. Everyone's paying attention because I just said age. So that's great.
Christina, can I just point out that for both direct and indirect identifiers, job position has come up, and it could
Yes.
be both. It's probably worth noting that there are certain types of identifiers that can be either direct or indirect, depending on the context of it. Like a
Yes.
job where you're a football coach of this team in this year is obviously very identifiable. There's only going to be one coach of that team, usually, I think, one coach of that team in that year. But generally speaking, if you say a teacher or something like that, not quite as identifiable.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Now that's a very good point, Maureen. And for example, chief statistician. I mean, there's one chief statistician. That's a very good point. And I guess that's the difficulty when it comes with indirect identifiers because there's so many, and we can see them coming now. We have crimes committed, occupation or job title, school attending, education affiliation, location, hometown, GPS. GPS, it depends because if it's the full GPS coordinates, and sometimes they do happen, they have the full GPS coordinates, not necessarily of the home, sometimes of the school where they studied or where they installed specific things. That again can be a full direct identifier. You can track to a single location, you can pinpoint it on the map. Um, Combinations, that's fantastic because it does come around the different combinations of the information. That's why we're talking about this data context overall, because it's not only about, oh, if I just have age, imagine a table, right, where we just have age. Someone is 25, someone is 74, someone is 99, right? Quite a high value. If I only know that, that doesn't indirectly identify someone because I only know they're 99. That's it. I don't know where they're from. I don't know what kind of school they attended. I don't know what kind of occupation or job title they have and so on. So yes, combinations of different identifiers. So yeah, all of these were made available in the Menti. So that's fantastic. We had names, we had addresses, national insurance numbers, NHS numbers, IP addresses, email addresses, and so on. And then indirect identifiers, sex, age, region, occupation, income, ethnicity, religious affiliation, and so on. Now, we also like to make the differentiation because sometimes they can be used interchangeably, but they're not quite interchangeable terms. De-identification of data refers to this process of removing or masking the direct identifiers, while anonymization refers to the process of ensuring that the risk of identifying a data subject is negligible. So if we look at them separately, when we de-identify data, we just removed all the direct identifiers we have been talking about, including some that in other situations might be indirect identifiers. When it comes to anonymization, we're taking absolutely everything into account. So the age, the gender, the occupation, and so on. When we talk about anonymization, it's also important to think about this utility because we know when it comes to having the full data, the personal data, even if it doesn't have names, the identified data is still personal data. The data utility is going to be at its highest. You can do so much research with that type of data. But the access controls are really stringent and they need to be stringent. We're talking about very detailed, sensitive personal data. So not everyone can access that data. As we start anonymizing the data utility does become lower, but the access controls become lower as well. But the information loss is quite huge. So again, another thing to consider when we're talking about anonymizing data for future data sharing is whether different versions of the data can be made available. And a lot, it usually happens with larger organizations because, of course, it's a resource consideration as well to be able to create multiple formats of data. But these organizations are usually making available a safeguarded version where the indirect identifiers have been treated quite a lot. But they also make available a controlled version where, again, we don't have the direct identifiable information, but the indirect identifiable information is still present almost as collected. There are situations where we can't actually make available absolutely everything. So when it comes to the ICO guidance, and again, all the slides are made available. So I urge everyone to check the website. It's fantastic. And they have this really nice graph. I do love that graph. We talk about directly identifiable data, that's personal data, indirectly identifiable data, where the risk of identifiability is not sufficiently low, still personal data, data unlikely to be identified, so this risk of identifying an individual is considered sufficiently low, effective anonymization, and data that is impossible to identify, genuinely anonymous information. Again, do check that fantastic ICO guidance. Anonymization in practice. So we've collected this personal data. Anna Thompson, she, her, 45, went to her chemotherapy treatment in April 2020 at Bakersfield Hospital. So much information in here. So at the beginning, we might actually change Anna Thompson with a pseudonym Charlie. Still keep the pronouns she, her. We keep the age as is. Went to her chemotherapy treatment in April 2020. Very, very detailed information at Bakersfield Hospital. This is still personal data. Then we go on to actually reducing where the hospital is. We still have Charlie, she, her, 45, went to her chemotherapy treatment. Again, this is still personal data. When we start working more with the indirect identifiers, Charlie, 4554, went to her chemotherapy treatment in 2020. We no longer have that month, we only have the year at a hospital in England. So we've reduced the geographical location to quite a high area. We can think of this as anonymized data and most specifically, effectively anonymized data because even this data might need to be made available under access controls. In an output, when we're publishing is different. I'm thinking when you have all the data, because you're not only going to have that little bit of information, you're going to actually have information about how the treatment went, how she felt after, and so on. I just realized that's quite a sad example. We need to put a more positive example in there. Now,
Somebody gets a new
indirect.
puppy or something.
Yes,
That'll be
yes.
modify that.
As I was reading it, I was like, that's quite sad. Um, Now, when it comes to indirect identifiers, I can't stress enough how important the context is. And when planning anonymization, actually thinking the subject of your data and the sample characteristics. We have a couple of people that have answered there. They're working with longitudinal data. Again, additional considerations come in there because, for example, the sample that you've used for your longitudinal data might already be known, right? Because you've only selected people that were born in 2020. So the sample characteristics and the subject of your data must always be considered when you set up an anonymization plan. And again, we need to balance that data utility against potential information loss and consider how access controls can be used. Most of the data can be shared. Not a lot of the data can be shared under a Creative Commons license for absolutely everyone to use for different reasons. But this is where responsible repositories and, of course, trusted research environments come in to help with that. Now, we hope this information is going to come in very, very handy because, and again, this is applicable for both quant and qual data. These are indirect identifiers that you are going to be finding in transcript data, in survey data, longitudinal data, and so on. When it comes to age, a lot of researchers do collect the date of birth. So you might have the full date of birth, maybe the day, month, year, age, have a single year, age in months, age banded, and so on. Now, single year of age is often considered one of the most important demographic information present in data, and it's quite important to keep that in the data. We have seen it where, again, over anonymization, just trying to protect participants. It was done from a good place, but all of this was deleted from the data, so others can't actually be using that data properly because you do want to understand where the data was collected and how do you put it in the wider context. Always consider that anonymization techniques can render some numeric analysis impossible. So, for example, calculating the mean, if that's something that you need to do. Um, Anonymization of other variables in the file might make more detailed age variables such as year and month of birth less disclosive. And again, we're thinking of the access control as well. If it's really important to make available the month of birth, and there are research situations where it's really important to do that, maybe we need to consider tweaking a little bit more the occupation as an example, and then adding that under a closed permission only access and making available a standard safeguarded version where it's just that end user license terms and conditions that apply just as the single year of age or banded ages. Another one that keeps coming up, and again in various transcript and numerical data, is education. We might have highest level of education, field of study, duration of study, type of institution. Now, where possible, standard coding schema, coding frame should be used. ONS Census 2021 actually make available this fantastic highest level of qualification that they can be used. And again, it doesn't matter if we're referring to survey long data, numerical data, or qualitative data. Even in qualitative data, these coding frames can be used and they do come in especially handy. Employment, and again, employment takes a varied forms. Occupation classification, job role title, type of work, employment sector, industry sector, employment type. Again, it is always recommended that this employment information is categorized and coded, especially for secondary research, because we want to make it easier for our researchers. And there's a couple of classifications that can be used. That's why we make all the slides available. There's so many links in here that I'm sure you'll go back to. Oh, can I use this? SOC 2010, the most new one is the SOC 2020, and we also have the NSEC that can be used as well when it comes to indirect identifiers as employment. Unique job titles, as we've just chatted before, they can lead to very easy identification. So those need to be bared in mind. Now, I'm a quant researcher by heart. Another thing to bear in mind with employment is the string variables in your numerical data, because sometimes they end up putting their full job title in there. So we've seen it more times than we expected. So string variables, always check them for that.
It might
Mm.
also just wanted to add as well that a lot of people probably already know this, but they do have coding tools. So if you're taking a more specific job role and you're trying to code it into, this NSSEC or SOC 2020, they have coding tools where you would type in the job title, and then it'll code it into whatever kind of coding frame that you're using. So those are quite useful as well.
No, that's fantastic. That's a very good point because again, it's not just about removing the information, it's making the most we can out of the information. So just tweaking it slightly as needed. Income, again, that does come quite often, maybe more often in numerical data, income in pounds, savings, depth as well. Depth is a huge one in transcript data as well. Um, and there can be uniquely outlying values, and very high or very low can lead to re-identification. Financial information is to be carefully checked and ensure that the level of detail provided does not compromise the identity of participants. Similar to age, you need to bear in mind that some statistical analyses where individual numbers are required will not be possible, so data utility should always be considered. And again, sometimes it might be that stringent access controls are needed to be able to make this data available. Now, geographical information, our nemesis most of the time, because when the geographical information is actually high level, say for example, we only have the country, re-identification is really difficult. I only have the country. Well, unless I have very many outliers for a specific individual, that's possible. But a lot of studies do not only benefit, but it's really necessary to make available lower geographical information. It might be regions, it might be county, it might be town, local authority. We've seen, for example, with election data, we do need to have that information. It's important when doing research. We might have postcode sector, postcode district, and we had partial postcode coming up in our mentis as well. Grid references, latitude and longitude. Now we're talking about the full problematic ones. Now, always consider again the characteristics of the study, the sample size, and the individual data that you are anonymizing. It is advisable that for any geographical information more detailed than regions, stringent access control is applied. So when we make available, for example, local authority, postcodes, partial postcodes, full postcodes, those are usually under the control, the full 5 safe framework. There are situations where partial postcode or local authority could be made available under safeguarded special license access, where there is actually an application in place and an additional terms of use as well. So that is doable as well. What's important to bear in mind then is again that data usability. Is the data, does the data need to have far more granular geographical information? Nothing stops you from making data available that only has regions, safeguarded data under standard terms and conditions. But you might also want to make some lower level geographies available, and that's possible under stringent access control. Other indirect identifiers that again we see a lot in data are dates of life events, and that could be the date of marriage, the date of adoption, divorce, death, treatment, court appearance, different dates. Reducing the exact dates to month and year might remove enough detail when considering other information available. In other cases, it might just be that the year only can be provided. As always, it is important to assess how important the information is for secondary research. Changes will decrease data usability. So again, access conditions should be more stringent when we really need to make. So, for example, there are some collections where date of death is made available. Again, that is control data made available only under the 5 safe framework. Ethnicity, national identity, and religion. ONS comes to save us again because they have this fantastic classification of ethnic group, national identity, and religion data based on the most recent census 2021-2022. And again, as Maureen was saying, you can use that to reclassify. So we're not making available the lowest level, we're actually reclassifying and we're using this framework, this coding schema. sensitive information, racial or ethnic origin, they're sensitive information as well, but also political opinions, religious or philosophical beliefs, trade union membership, genetic, biometric data, health information, information concerning a person's sex life, and sexual orientation. Now, some of this information, as previously mentioned, may include details that are actually really harmful if identified. So we really need to treat them very carefully. They may need to be edited. The issue with that, especially with high edits, for example, oh, I can't include the health information because it's sensitive data, the health information at all. That's going to be problematic because then secondary researchers are not going to be able to use that data. So again, the stringent access conditions should be considered when we're talking about this sensitive information. Can't stress enough, it is about the combination of information. We're not looking at a cell by cell. Oh, in age I have this, in occupation I have that, in religion. No, it's looking at the row, at the individual, where I would say realizing again, we're not just looking at numbers, we're looking at people. Yes, we see numbers in our front door, we see words in front of us, but behind those numbers, behind those words, pictures, whatever they might be, is data that comes from people. So we're thinking of that combination. We're not simply editing one piece of information in isolation, we're considering this wider context. That's why I use those gears there. I was very proud when I found a picture of gears. Um, when it comes to data anonymization steps, we try to split it in three actionable steps. Find and assess identifiers, and we're talking about both direct and indirect identifiers. Implement anonymization techniques, and we're going to be talking about different anonymization techniques for different types of data. And review the data and reassess any remaining disclosure risks. So to bear in mind is you might do some changes. You always need to check whether the disclosure has been minimized. Take the transcript again and read it. Think, oh, okay, that's okay. Or actually, I need to consider this as well. So it's always important to go back to the data. Also, ONS have come up with this intruder testing, which involves using individuals described as friendly intruders to try and see if they are able to re-identify anyone in the data set. To bear in mind, there are data protection implications in this, so most likely you are going to have to do a data privacy impact assessment to be able to do an intruder testing. But it can come in extremely helpful to actually ensure that your data has been effectively anonymized. It has been usually used for numerical data, but Maureen and I were talking, it actually can be used for qual data as well and be used quite usefully for qual data. So something to bear in mind. It is not intended as a replacement for theoretical disclosure. So I had someone tested and they're saying, oh, I can't identify anyone, therefore I don't need to do anything. No, you still need to check the data. Make sure that it is anonymized. Now, very, very quick Menti. I'll leave the QR code for just a little bit. I'll move it maybe above. Yeah, there it is. It's still the same Menti, still the same QR code, still the same code. Which of the following examples is effectively anonymized data? Data where names have been replaced by pseudonyms, fake names, data where the risk of re-identification is negligible, or password protected data. We have some key takeaway messages today, yes. We're talking about effectively anonymized data. I know you can't take your answers back sadly with Menti. Effectively anonymized data is where this risk of re-identification is negligible. When we are just removing the names with pseudonyms, with fake names, so instead of saying Christina, we're saying Josh, for example. I don't think I ever thought of the name Josh before. That's something. That is still personal data. It's de-identified data only. Everything else is in there. But when we're talking about that risk of re-identification being made negligible, that's when we're talking about effectively anonymized data. I like that someone said password protected data. That was a trick option. No, I mean, Are there situations where a specific file could have been effectively anonymized and then password protected, and it's effectively anonymized before it's password protected? Fair point, fair point. But no, the correct answer is data where the risk of re-identification is negligible. And as discussed, it's not only the anonymization that we're using, the anonymization techniques, is actually all the access controls that we're applying on the data as well. I'm glad someone selected password protected data because it makes you think, yes, what if it's effectively anonymized before? So, um, a little bit about anonymization techniques for numerical data. When it comes to numerical data, we refer to non-perturbative and perturbative techniques. To go into perturbative techniques, probably that's going to be at least a day. They can be quite complex. You need different tools to use them. They can be fantastic as well, pram, post-randomization, and so on. But the most common anonymization methods for numerical data are usually non-perturbative, and they include recoding, banding, top and bottom coding, and generalization. So let's take an example. What do we mean recoding or categorization? I have ethnicity. I have really detailed ethnicity here. I have black Caribbean, white Irish, black African, Asian, Pakistani, white Scottish, black and white. Well, I can't make all of that data available because in my data file, I also have very detailed age and occupation information, and I have their religion. So I decide to actually make a far broader category when it comes to ethnicity to use that ONS guide. That's amazing. That's where this comes from. They have these very straightforward categories. They reduce them to just 6 categories overall. To bear in mind, again, the data usability here is going to be far less, right? But to be able to protect the participants, you do need to work on this specific data. Banding or binning, this is usually for continuous variables. So we're talking here about age, income that's collected as full. So say, for example, I have income. I have quite a lot of different incomes in here, right? Instead of just top and bottom coding, say, for example, we say under 10,000 and over 100,000, that reduces quite well. In terms of data usability, is better because you have all the values in between as they are. But when it comes to disclosure risk, to the risk of being re-identified, that can be potentially challenging. So this is where banding comes in. And again, there are standard bands, 10,000 to 24,999, 25,000 to 4,999, and so on. This is banding or binning. Top and bottom coding, similar as the previous one, we're just taking the very first and the very last. Say, for example, I'm only including 80 over. I have here someone that's 118. I mean, that's problematic, right? Probably there are not a lot of people that are 118. Very, very easy to identify someone that's 118. Again, when it comes to top and bottom coding, it's also considering the sample, the characteristics of the data subjects that you have, and also what secondary researchers might need. So sometimes the top and bottom coding might start lower or upper. It might be that you actually need to top and bottom code at 75 plus, thinking in terms of pension age and so on. This is not a clear cut, you top and bottom code here. It depends on the data, but it's a fantastic method for reducing the risk of identification. And then we have generalization, even for survey data. As I said, the free text, the string response is sometimes our biggest enemies when it comes to survey data. I always remember this because it was really unexpected. We had this very straightforward survey file. Top and bottom coded, banded. It looked amazing. And then it had a string variable. So, okay, let's look at what's available in the string variables. It was a very long string variable as well. It was mostly empty with a couple of exceptions. Some of them were perfectly fine, but the one actually went into detail about how this person doesn't get pension because their son, and it actually had the name of the son, moved to somewhere else. And yes, it was almost like a little bit of a transcript out of nowhere in a string, in a survey. So, for example, you might have the original detailed response. I'm responsible for leading a cybersecurity initiative specifically focusing on blockchain technology security and data encryption techniques. Again, this is very, very detailed. And especially when thinking of all the other information we have, say, for example, we have the region where this person is based, their age, the type of sector that they work in. Well, it becomes potentially easy to identify who they are. So you can actually use a generalized text involved in IT security and data protection. It's important to still keep the main elements of this, right? We don't want to just say IT. No, we're saying in data protection to the blockchain technology. Now that is it for me for now. I'm passing over to Maureen. I shall go drink some water. Thank you, Maureen.
No problem. Let's see. Have I got control already? Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk specifically about considerations for anonymization of qualitative data. If I can move this. Oh, yes, here we go. Sorry, I've gone too far now. All right. So qualitative research, qualitative data is based on this wider understanding, this nuanced understanding. And as such, it's often seeking quite rich, detailed information from your participants. So it can be really difficult to decide what are you going to anonymize? What might you leave as is? So sometimes that detail is really important context for the analysis. So anonymizing the data, especially if it's overdone, can compromise the integrity of the data. So some types of data, like audio and video, and I saw those kind of pop up in one of the earlier question polls, are direct identifiers themselves because someone's image or the sound of their voice is unique to them. So I'm going to go through a few examples of some case studies to help you consider how you might manage some of that qualitative data, and just a couple other considerations that you might take into account when approaching your own qualitative data sets. The key with qualitative data, I think, and hopefully the takeaway point, is that you need to find some sort of balance in your anonymization and really lean into that three-pronged strategy that Christina was talking about. That will help you kind of make those considerations of what you can leave in versus what really needs to be changed. So within qualitative data, one of the most used types of data that we see is transcript data. So we'll have a look at the anonymization techniques for transcript data. So firstly, any direct identifier should be replaced with pseudonyms. And specifically, it really can't just be redacted. We have seen that in some of the collections that come in. It's really important to use those pseudonyms because it maintains the relationships that are already present within the data. So there's greater readability of that text. Pseudonyms should be consistent throughout the project. You may also want to think about pseudonyms across collections. So often we see interview transcripts that, for example, use the speaker tag of interviewer and respondent, just I and R, and that's it. But actually, between different interviews, there's at least a different respondent, if not also potentially a different interviewer. And certain types of analyses, that kind of detail matters. So looking across the data set to make sure that the pseudonyms are unique per person rather than just kind of using these much vaguer kind of general and broad pseudonyms. Indirect identifiers can use the strategies of categorizing and generalizing information that Christina had mentioned. Where an indirect identifier has been identified, you can replace that in the text. We tend to notate this with square brackets so you know what's been replaced, and you can see what it's been replaced with. So you can see an example of that in the categorization for the years that are mentioned there. Okay, so when we are thinking about anonymizing our transcript data, it's important to make sure you've got an anonymization plan in place from the start. So that anonymization plan will outline some sort of mandatory anonymization, which will be what are the direct identifiers within that data? What other characteristics are likely to lead to a disclosure, such as, for example, a very specific town or a very specific date? And it will also outline how you will treat that data. So are you going to give a pseudonym? Are you going to reassign some of those categories to a higher level? You should also outline, however, any potential anonymization. So this is anything that you can think of that would come up in the data that just might need a little bit of a careful eye on. So there might be a mention, for example, of specific health conditions or of court cases or something like that, that perhaps it doesn't come up in every single interview, but where it does come up, it should garner your attention to see, does this need some generalization or other editing to help with the anonymization overall of the collection. When making changes, you can use the find and replace function. So make sure you know what some of the options are in those. I mean, we often use the find and replace, a really easy way of just addressing the entire document so that you know that you've captured all of the, for example, if a name is used, just use a find and replace on that name so you don't have to search for it manually. But there are some neat tricks that you can use if you know what they are. So asterisks are treated as wildcards, so you can capture different kinds of spellings or, the end of a verb, so that you can get all the different conjugations, etc. And make sure you review each of those changes rather than just hitting replace all. It does take a little bit of time to do it that way, but I've read transcripts where words often contain the same letters in a row that were unintentionally changed. They just accidentally swapped some of the letters and things like that. So it's really important that you use some of those tools to help you capture everything and still do that kind of manual check over. Finally, make sure you identify those changes within your transcript. So I mentioned using brackets, square brackets is the usual kind of annotation that would be used. Sometimes that information can make a difference to the analysis. So it's important for reusers or yourself, if you're working with your anonymized data, to know where changes have been made. It may make a difference in how you look at and treat that data. If you decide not to use square brackets, I mean, you can use sort of anything you want to, but you just want to make sure that you outline that within some sort of guideline to transcribers or to users of that data, that you've specified there how you have annotated some of those changes. All right, and next we have we have an example of an anonymized transcript, what it might look like. So here you can see that the names, the dates, the region have all been changed. Now this particular example is a very light touch. In terms of anonymization, you can see there's still quite a lot of information further down. And I'm going to talk, and it's specifically from this collection, I believe, I'm going to talk about an example of how we addressed some of those concerns with the access controls. But this just gives you a flavor of what it might look like then when you start that anonymization process. You make sure that you're consistent throughout the entire transcript in terms of changing any names or any dates, etc. So, first case study, though, that I wanted to look at is from one of our collections called The Pioneers of Social Research. So, Christina had mentioned the possibility of open data. And she said sometimes you work with participants who are quite well known, and it's already been agreed with them that their data could be open. And this is a great example of a qualitative data set of which I can probably count potentially on one hand how many qualitative data sets that we have as open. But this is a great example of one of those qualitative data sets that is available as open access. And part of the reason is that all of the participants within this study were leading sociologists, historians, and anthropologists. So they were all very well published. They were all well known within their disciplines. And the interview style themselves, these kind of life story interviews, were very rich in detail about their lives, about their education and their careers. I think the longest interview within this collection is over 12 hours long with someone. So, there is quite a lot of details in there. So anonymization in this case would have been a really fruitless exercise and actually quite problematic because part of the value of this data was the fact that it did have this rich detail about these individuals' lives. So instead, what Thompson did was seek explicit permission from his participants to be able to use their names and other personal data. Now, having said that, I said you should come up with an anonymization plan from the start that will outline your mandatory anonymization and your potential anonymization. Now, even though we didn't have any mandatory anonymization here, because he had permission to be able to release that information. We still had an anonymization plan in place, and we did still do some edits to some of the interviews. So what we were looking for when we were reviewing those transcripts were issues where participants talked about, for example, details of court cases where we weren't entirely sure whether or not those were closed court cases, medical conditions of others who weren't involved in the study, and anything that might have been said that would cause any kind of reputational damage. So we felt we had an ethical responsibility to still do a review of that data and make some changes where the information might have lied outside some of our own ethical boundaries. Okay, so even though we had full permission to kind of, open up this data, we still had an anonymization plan in place. Okay, one of the types of data that came up, I think, in one of the polls was questions about image and audio data in particular. And these are really difficult types of data to work with, as the data itself is personal data. So a person's image and the uniqueness of their voice makes it identifiable already. So the best strategy for dealing with this kind of data is to ensure that any processing is done with consent. It is possible as well to blur out images or revoice transcripts. There does come a point where you have to wonder whether or not that depletes the value of the data too much. So for example, what's the point of supplying an image if the image has to be largely blurred out? So instead, we recommend ensuring that there is clear consent to publish any of that data, and really think about some of those access conditions. Also be aware of identifying context. So things like jewelry or tattoos or backgrounds that might be very specific to that individual and in and of themselves might work to identify someone unintentionally. Also make sure that you're using software that operates locally. So apps like GIMP and Audacity, for example, are open source tools which you can download and use locally on your computer. You don't have to transfer the data anywhere to work with it on a different platform. You can work with it on your own computer. And importantly, you need to double check that you can't undo that anonymization. So for example, if you've tried to blur out an image or part of an image, try to resharpen it to make sure that that blurring has been effective enough. All right, and next, I believe we've got, it is not allowing me to start the Menti here. Oh no, there we go. We've got another couple of Menti questions. So again, you can just use the QR code. It's the same link as before. We've just moved the slide on to this next question. Which of the following techniques are appropriate for anonymizing transcript data? So replacing direct identifiers with pseudonyms, categorization of indirect identifiers, generalization of indirect identifiers, or all of the options. There is one clear winner here of all of the options. Give you just another minute to have a look at that. Yeah, so the strategies that Christina had gone through are all applicable to qualitative data as well. So absolutely, you can generalize and make sure you capture some of those indirect identifiers as well as replacing direct identifiers with pseudonyms. But you can also try strategies like categorization of certain kinds of variables within the data. So I had mentioned the coding tool. That's something that I've used in the past where we've had specific job titles that were mentioned within interview data, and we were assembling the metadata, and we just went through and used the coding tool for occupations to categorize it to, like the professional working kind of categories that ONS have outlined. So you can use those same strategies for qualitative data. And if you just stay on Menti, we just have another couple of questions here. If I can just move this down so you can see the question. What is an effective anonymization technique commonly applied to continuous variables? Christina, this is coming from your quant side. So for a continuous variable, is it generalization, banding, or recoding? I think we have a lot of quant people with us. It is banding. They've done well. Excellent. Yeah, you can do some banding with it. So you can do that kind of top end and bottom end binning, or you can create categories within the data to do some banding throughout.
Things
Oh,
happening with the Menti just kept going
I
24,
know it's going
25.
back and forth between those. Let's see if we can.
Hopefully this one will
Okay.
work.
And I think this is the last question maybe. When considering data sharing, what are the main approaches to ensuring participants are protected? So with anonymization, I know that the key kind of consideration here, other than ensuring that you're legally compliant, et cetera, but really I think what a lot of researchers are worried about is their participants and any risks to their participants and maintaining any kind of confidentiality that's been discussed. Um, so how do we ensure that participants are protected? We've got consent, anonymization, access controls, or all three. And excellent. We've got all three. So those who said access control or consent are also right, but you want to make sure this is done in conjunction with the other options as well. So we promote this three-prong approach. To anonymization. So not just thinking about how we treat the data, but also thinking about the context in which the data sits. So who has access to it, what's been discussed with the participant, and we utilize all three to ensure that participants are fully informed and fully protected. Okay, so we do have some further resources for you to have a look at as well. There's loads of information on our website. If you are interested in kind of exploring some of the specific topics that were raised here, we do have some specific pages. So we've got some pages on anonymizing data and de-identifying and anonymizing transcript data, as well as de-identifying and anonymizing numerical data. We've also got the ONS policy and the SESTA data management expert guide, which might also be useful. So have a look through some of those further resources. And we've got some useful semi-automated tools mentioned here. So a lot of these are quant ones, so the SDC micro, the QA my data, I think are quite popular ones. There are a few text anonymizer tools for qualitative data. I think this is something that we're going to see more qualitative data tools in future. So we have a text anonymization helper tool, which is just a macros kind of add-on to any Word documents. So if you're using Microsoft Word, you can add on this text anonymizer tool. And it basically just highlights things like capital letters and numbers where there's likely to be an identifier there. There is also TextWash, which is an open source tool that uses Python, which can help you find and replace those direct identifiers. And Christina was telling me about another tool, Presidio from Microsoft, which will also be able to help you work with qualitative data. We've got anonymization and AI concerns. So, Christina, did you want to uh, have a word here about some of the AI
Yes.
considerations?
Yes, of course. I've just put all the links in the chat for the tools because I know we'll make the slides available, but I know some of you cannot wait to try the tools immediately after the workshop. It always comes up. So all the links for the tools are available. And again, they're freeware. You don't have to pay absolutely nothing for it. So it's always let's try it out. Will it help me? And sometimes is the simplest solutions that are making our life much easier. So, for example, the macro that we created for Word, it simply highlights everything that's in a capital letter or contains numbers, but it's fantastically helpful in seeing, do I still have names? Do I still have their addresses? Now, Microsoft Presidio is something very new, just discovered. We're looking forward to actually testing it at the UK Data Service as well properly. It's fantastic because it actually highlights where it identifies different direct or indirect identifiers. You can feed it your own list as well. You can add denied list or actually acceptable. So, for example, as Maureen was saying, it's really important sometimes to use proper pseudonyms, not just random names that we come up with, having a proper strategy in place in there. You can actually add those pseudonyms in as acceptable so the tool doesn't prompt you, oh, you keep having Maria here and you keep having John here. No, those are my pseudonyms, they're fine. So for qual data, transcript data especially, that's a tool that might save a lot of time. And the QA My Data that we've developed at UK Data Service from a quant perspective, that's also useful in terms of giving you a health check, basically, for it accepts CSV, SPSS, and data, and it gives you a brief overview of do you actually have metadata for your data, but from an anonymization point of view, it can use regular expressions to actually catch anything that might cause issues. For example, postcodes, phone numbers, anything that follows this regular expression. So, but all the links are in the chat. I just love tools, so I discovered something, I add it onto the onto the slide. Now, when it comes to anonymization and AI considerations, this came up during our introduction to effective research data management. There are a lot of concerns when it comes to AI. To bear in mind is when we're using AI, and I think there is a question on the Padlet about this, when we're using AI for anonymization of personal data is data processing, therefore is subject to UK GDPR and DPA. So all the key legal obligations, such as the lawful basis for processing, the purpose limitations, the data minimization, and security of the platforms that you're using apply. So it's really important to have these appropriate technical and organizational measures in place for the storage of the data. A lot of the AI tools that are now available, I don't want to name names because they're fantastic tools. They can be used for some fantastic things, but maybe not for anonymizing data. When you're simply uploading your data onto a website that you have absolutely no control over, you don't actually know where that data is going and you don't know who's going to be able to use that data. There are indeed really fantastic tools to be used, but please, please, please have consideration around where that data is being transferred. If you have any questions, as I said at the beginning, the whole point of our workshop sessions is to build, of course, capacity, but also to act as a gateway to getting in touch with us. Just ask us the questions. Is it okay if I use this? Or is it okay if I use that? And we have our data sharing mailbox that can be used for that. The other consideration is around how AI systems could potentially reconstruct or infer identities from anonymized data. So say you've anonymized your data using maybe an AI tool that's deployed in-house, Microsoft Presidio as an example, but you are worried that others might be using AI tools to discover the identities of people in the data. This is a growing concern. So this is why we're really insistent on the three-prong approach to data sharing rather than just sharing the data out there with no terms and conditions for reuse, considering how people are going to use that data specifically. An example at UK Data Service, we in the end user license agreement that applies to all the different usages of the data for safeguarded and controlled data, we clearly specify that others that are using data, secondary researchers, should not try to identify anyone in the data. It's a key clause in that legally binding document, but also around the use of AI, and not necessarily just AI, but online data tools, because it might be that the secondary researcher doesn't even want to infer the identity or try to realize, is this my neighbor? I can find out what kind of a salary they have or anything like that. It might be that they want to use online data tools for data analysis. Again, those online data tools come with issues around the storage of data, and we have quite a bit of information in our research data handling and security guide. There's a question around this on the Padlet, so I'll add the link to the guide in there as well, because that might come in handy. And again, I can't stress enough, just get in touch with any questions, not only around AI consideration and anonymization, but when it comes to research data management overall. Now, very briefly, let's see if the scale went the other way, or more people are confident today that yes, I can share more data, I can anonymize it and make more data available. How confident are you now in your understanding of anonymization? Yes, we're getting more confident. You can say it could have went the other way around. It can happen. Um, that's why we make all the slides and all the materials available. It's a difficult topic. I had a friend that said when it comes to anonymization and disclosure control, it almost feels like the dark arts. Yes, it does feel like the dark arts. Sometimes you're sitting there with the data and it's like, oh. But we are here to help, and hopefully ease that stressful situation that researchers can be in, because it can be very stressful. At the end of the day, we all want to do no harm, so it's important to make sure that we protect our participants. And look, we have four very confident. It was just one at the beginning. That's fantastic. That's
It's
amazing news.
and I know sometimes questions come up that are very specific to your project. Like I've gotten
Yes,
a couple of queries about anonymization in the past over ethnographic studies, which is very challenging because of the
yes.
way ethnography is kind of done, where consent isn't really formally done and recorded in the same way as other kinds of projects. So, where you do, or people get in touch because they have audio or video data, and want to know a little bit more about what they can do to, if anything, to share the data. So, if you do have specific questions on your project, um, please do get in touch. We can always give you a little bit more specific guidance there, or at least share the kinds of practices that we've seen where there might be a similar kind of situation arise.
Yes, yes, exactly. No, and it sometimes it might be that we can do it via email. Sometimes it might be that a Zoom or a Teams meeting. It's easier to just have a chat around that. And also within the content of this workshop, we try to address as many things as possible. But we've seen in the audience we have some attendees that are actually working with EEG data and that type of medical data and so on. And again, there are some things that we can advise on those as well when it comes to MRI scans and so on, maybe using DICOM because it allows privacy by design and so on. So there, please get in touch. That is the that is the takeaway message. Now, in terms of all the resources that we make available, the anonymization workshop is actually one of the latest ones in our training session, in our training session. So, but we have all of the events on our UK Data Service events webpage. So you will find events about consent, about ethical and legal considerations, about secondary data use. And again, all of them are actually recorded. All the materials are made available. So please do have a look about documentation as well. Anonymization goes hand in hand in documentation. So please have a look on there. And of course, you can subscribe to our Gmail mailing list. We're on Blue Sky now, LinkedIn, X, Twitter. Still calling it Twitter. And our YouTube channel as well has a lot of different other videos. It has all of the training videos that we do, but it has some bite-sized videos as well around accessing data, and how do I, for example, deposit data with UK Data Service and so on.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. And do have a look at some of our other workshops in case some of the, like Hina's, for example, on legal and ethical considerations and research might be of interest, especially given some of the questions around consent and that sort of thing.
No, thank you, Oliver. So, oh, I've just seen the chat. Look, people are finding this useful. That's fantastic. Please pop in the feedback form any information that you might need. We might need a session about this or a session about that because that's something that we always consider. We're here to help as much as we can. Thank you all ever so much for joining. And again, hopefully this is just the beginning of a very nice dialogue. Thank you.